Leon Fresco is an immigration attorney in Holland and Knights, Washington office, where he focuses his practice on providing global immigration representation to businesses and individuals. He was, before that, he worked on the Hill, and he was a primary drafter of the US Senate's Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill of 2013, which is one of the last big efforts to have Congress do something about this. I've asked Leon to come, give the kind of the overview of what a reporter who has been tasked with covering immigration needs to know right now, and what they need to kind of anticipate will be coming down the pike. So we have Leon until 12 o'clock, and I will turn it over to Leon. So thanks very much. Oh, and also I'm gonna stick into chat a very nice profile of Leon that was done by one of my former colleagues, Franco Ordonez. He was with McClatchy at the time. Now he's with NPR, and so we'll stick this in resources also. But this is how I first got introduced to Leon a few years ago. So Leon, I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, thanks everybody. Welcome. I want to talk to you today about immigration. If at any time you have a question, please stop and tell me to stop and ask the question, because I hate hearing the sound of my own voice. So I would rather hear your questions and answer them. But if you don't have questions, which for some reason people never have questions until the end, then I'll just do the presentation and people can ask the questions at the end, however you want to do it. But I'm here to talk to you today both about the issues you're hearing about and writing about in the news, but also about some of the issues that you're not hearing about or writing about, and to give you context on both of them about why they're so complicated and why it's hard to write on them, and why the problems continue to persist, albeit in slightly different evolutions and variations as we move forward. So if we go to the first slide called background, and I don't know what we can see on your screen at the moment, but once we get, okay,
now we're seeing the full slide now.
Yeah, okay, so there we go. Now I can see it too. There's four main challenges facing the Biden administration in the next 4 years. The most immediate one is the border emergency, so we'll talk about that first. But over the course of the next 4 years, and maybe 8 years, but you can only plan on 4 because that's the way it works. You want to talk about also what's going to happen to people who are here without status in the United States, both legislatively and administratively. Third, what's going to happen to people who tried to access the immigration system legally? And so that's a very, very important question, because the Trump administration did a lot over the last 4 years to try to basically dismantle the entire system by which people come to the United States legally as well. And I think that's an important issue that very few people focus on. And then finally, what are the prospects for any kind of immigration legislation over the next 4 years? So go to the next slide. And we start with the border emergency. And so when people talk about the border emergency, it's important that they realize that there's a lot of different things going on at the same time with regard to the border emergency. So first, there's different kinds of people crossing the border for different kinds of reasons from different countries. So people think of it all as, or not, I don't know who, but it's easy to think of it. Let me not put any accusations on anyone, but it's easy to think of it as one crisis. And it's not one crisis, it's a lot of different things happening at the same time. First of all, there's 4 different countries that are involved in this. There's Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And at different times over the course of this last decade, it's been different individuals from these countries who have been coming. Right now, the border surge, the largest group that you're seeing from the unaccompanied minor route and the family route, is from Honduras. That wasn't always the case. Before, El Salvador had, when it was in the Obama administration, it was El Salvador that had the largest group of people coming into the United States. And that's because different conditions have changed in different of those countries. Third, for single adults, that's a predominantly Mexican phenomenon, where single adults from Mexico are seeking to cross the border to work in the United States. Yes, there are some from each of the other countries, but those are different than what was happening before. During the Obama administration and during the beginning of the Trump administration, we were actually getting very few border crossers from Mexico because the Mexican economy was quite strong and Mexico had a huge manufacturing base and people were actually emigrating to Mexico to work from some of the Central American countries. They didn't even need to go into the United States at that time. And now you're seeing a change where you have adult males from Mexico trying to enter the United States. So what are these groups? So the first group is unaccompanied minors, and those are, you got to get very, it's important to have a very specific legal definition to what is an unaccompanied minor. And in the law, it uses this terrible term, which I will only use once during this, but then I won't use it again because I don't like the term. Unaccompanied alien child, that's the term in the law. But that term, which we'll now call unaccompanied minor for the rest of this conversation, is that you are under the age of 18, you are not a US citizen or lawful permanent resident of the United States, and you are arriving without a father or a mother into the United States. So if you are even arriving with a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, you are, for all intents and purposes, an unaccompanied minor because your custodial parent is not with you when you are arriving at the border. So you're not arriving as a family unit. When you are a family unit, and that's the second part of this slide, it's because you're arriving with your custodial parent. And so many times, what people used to talk about during the Trump administration, family separation, which was a thing, you know, where they separated actual custodial parents from children. And they're saying family separation is still going on now. What they mean by that, and this was also going on in the Trump administration too, is that the government is put into a conundrum when an aunt arrives with their nephew or their niece to the United States, or when a grandparent arrives with their grandson or granddaughter to the United States. Those are not considered family units that can be processed together. That child is actually considered within the definition of an unaccompanied child because they are under the age of 18, they are not with their custodial parent, and they're not a US citizen or resident of the United States. And so that unaccompanied child needs to be processed through the system we're going to talk about in a second. Whereas, you know, the law doesn't have this dispensation for grandparents coming with their children or aunts and uncles or cousins coming with their children. Very, very complicated. And then finally, when we talk about this process, and I'm just being brief because I could do a whole seminar class on any of these things. So I'm just trying to be very brief. You also, when you're reporting about, well, what are the solutions to these issues on the border, you have to talk about, well, what do you mean by a solution? Do you mean a deterrent solution? Meaning, how do you get people to stop presenting themselves at the southern border? Or do you mean a solution that, you know, incentivizes people to do something else, and so that they're happy to do it, as opposed to that they're afraid to do it? And that would be in this addressing root causes phenomenon. Either A, they don't present themselves anywhere because they're just happy in their home, or they have a different route to present themselves. And so they're happy using this different route, as opposed to just a fear-based, don't come here, bad things will happen to you strategy. We can go to the next slide. I'll keep going. And so for when we talk about unaccompanied minors, we have to realize that a lot of this is baked into the cake, and there isn't a lot any government can do when an unaccompanied minor presents itself at the border. And that's because there was a settlement agreement reached in 1996 called the Flores Settlement Agreement, which was then basically enacted into law by Congress in 2008 as part of a law called the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which says that when an unaccompanied minor, other than a Mexican unaccompanied minor can be returned to Mexico immediately. But if the minor's from any other country, that minor has to be accepted into the United States and placed into the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services. And so they have a division called ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement. And all that office can do is to take that child and either keep them if there's nobody willing to care for them, or put them as soon as humanly possible into the custody of an adult who is a relative who is willing to take care of them. And the large, vast majority of said minors have some relative who is able to come forward and take care of them. And then what is supposed to happen is that minor then goes through a removal proceeding where either they can qualify for asylum or they can qualify for a status called special immigrant juvenile status, or they lose their case and then they would be ordered removed. So one of those three outcomes is usually what would happen with any such minor going through that process. The only thing that changed during the Trump administration, because nothing really changed with regard to unaccompanied minors. So unaccompanied minors during the entire course of the Trump administration were able to come into the country. So you have to be careful when people talk about, oh, the flooding is happening on the border. That's going to be more relevant toward family units. The only thing that changed during the Trump administration, which was not going to be a permanent change, and so this is a bit complicated, is that during the COVID crisis, the Trump administration had decided to turn back minors, unaccompanied minors, using what's called Title 42 CDC Exclusion Authority. And that's a congressional law which says that if the CDC says that a foreign national seeking to enter can potentially be a distributor of a communicable disease, you can exclude them during the time of an outbreak of a communicable disease. And so what had happened was the Trump administration began excluding unaccompanied minors using this authority. The same people who sued under the Flores settlement agreement said, hey, this agreement trumps that. It is more, if there's a conflict between these two things, the Flores settlement agreement wins and you still have to let in the kids. And so the judge who monitors this, her name is Dolly G in Los Angeles in the district court, she agreed and she said, you got to let in the kids. So then that reopened a time period of letting in the kids. And then right before the Trump administration concluded, the Ninth Circuit said, because the Ninth Circuit suddenly is now a 50-50 court. People think of it as a liberal court. It's no longer a liberal court. There's just as many Trump appointees as others. So they really made it a 50-50 court now. Came back and said, no. Title 42 supersedes the Forest Settlement Agreement. And if the government wants to exclude unaccompanied minors from America because of COVID, you can. And so Trump used that for like the last few days of the Trump administration, and the Biden administration immediately overturned that and said, we do not want to use this authority to exclude unaccompanied minors from the United States. And so that is one debate that's happening as we speak. Well, should the Biden administration be using this COVID authority? And so this is a little bit complicated because you don't have a uniform COVID policy in America right now. You have, if you are a vaccinated billionaire who has tons of businesses in Europe and you're trying to go and have some important things that you're trying to do in America with your businesses here in America, you're currently banned. You can't come in to America. You have to either leave Europe for 14 days and hang out in the Caribbean or somewhere, or you have to apply for an exception that you hope you can get. So it's totally up to the State Department. You can't sue if you don't get it. It's an arbitrary thing. So maybe you get it, maybe you don't get this exception. So there's whole swaths of the world, Europe, South Africa, Brazil, China, completely banned from entering the United States because of COVID. Again, even if you've been vaccinated, nobody cares. That's not even part of the equation. And so that's not exactly uniform with this issue of whether, there should be a COVID ban from people entering the southern border. And so it's a bit of a complicated issue. So what do we do about that? And this is a complicated question. And the administration has decided not to apply such a COVID ban for unaccompanied minors. One could have potentially, and I'm not saying I think one thing or the other, I'm just saying a potential other way to have handled this could have been at the beginning of the Biden administration to say, look, when we reach a certain threshold of vaccinations here in America, then we'll start letting everybody in. We don't need to do this from day one. And they would have used the time to build all the capacity they're trying to build right now. And then that capacity would have been ready for the lifting of the COVID ban. But that's not what ended up happening. And so it's a little bit maybe, right, so maybe it's a little bit Monday morning quarterback to discuss that. But there were people giving them that kind of advice. And, so, but that's just not the route they chose. And so we are where we are at this point. And so then another question that's important to ask here is, what is the decision point? Because the way the DHS people who come on the news now describe it is they always say, well, what am I supposed to do with this 9-year-old that presents them at the border? Am I supposed to turn them back into the desert in Mexico and die? Or am I supposed to accept them into the United States? So if you phrase it as that, of course, the decision point is let them in, unless you're some draconian, terrible human being. You would say the opposite. But most people would say let them in. But the question is that the only decision point in the process? Or is there a decision point earlier in the process where you can convince that same, because the 9-year-old doesn't come by themselves. That never happens. That what happens is the 9-year-old comes with an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or a grandparent or whatever, or a smuggler. And the question is, what is there a place in that process where the 9-year-old's calculus can be changed to do something different than to present themselves at the border? And that's a legitimate discussion that, for whatever reason, that as soon as the first question is articulated, the second question is never articulated by the media. There's never that pushback. Well, is there a second thing you can do so that this isn't the only choice that the government has? And so this is a very interesting question. If we go to the next slide. And so this is an issue that deals with both the entire family and with generally this complicated issue of refugees, because this is another important point to make here, is a lot of the discussion is totally misstated in all shapes and forms. And I'll just state it from an immigration law perspective. So if you're stating this from an immigration law perspective, the only people who are allowed to present themselves at the US border trying to enter is a refugee. And a refugee is a very specific thing. It's a person who's fleeing their country because they're going to be persecuted either by their government or by people their government cannot control on behalf of their or on account of their political opinion, their race, their religion, their national origin, or their social group. And so there is some debate about whether, if you will be persecuted by a gang because you don't want to join a gang, is that a credible refugee claim? Or if you will be persecuted by your domestic abuser because the government doesn't protect domestic abuse victims in those countries, are those assigned? That's a separate question. That's an important question. But the point is, if someone, however those questions get resolved, and Trump wanted to say those people are not protected, and Biden, I'm sure, will want to change that to say those people are protected. However that's decided, the point is, you can't just come just to get a job. That's never acceptable. You cannot, the immigration law does not allow you to come because life in your country is bad and you seek to have a better life in your country, in America. That's never permitted. And so why is this an important distinction to make about the difference between someone who's coming for economic circumstances and someone who's a refugee? Is because if someone is coming as a refugee, and that's the people who are the only people permitted to come, then the statement, "Don't come now," is an absurd statement on its face. It doesn't make any sense. It's not a real statement. Because imagine, just let's take the refugee that's probably the most understood as a refugee, a person in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. Telling that person "don't come now" is an absurd statement. Either they get the heck out of the concentration camp and get to America as soon as possible, or they die in the concentration camp. There's no other "don't come now" choice. That choice doesn't make any sense. So if you're saying a statement like "don't come now," you're saying something about what you think about the person, that they might not necessarily be a refugee. And this is a little bit of a complicated discussion, because either someone is a refugee, meaning they should just come because you're a come right now because you're going to die. It's a bad thing. Say it. Or what you're saying is something is, not exactly refugee about people, and they have a choice to make about when they can come and when they cannot come. And really, for those people, what the immigration law actually says is don't come ever. You should never come because you're not someone who's allowed to present yourself on the border. You must use legal immigration processes, which unfortunately the big problem is those don't exist. There's not a way to just come to America to work like that. You have to have an employer petition for you. You have to have certain skill sets. You either have to be a seasonal person who will come back. And if you want to stay more than seasonally, you have to be someone with a degree working in a high skilled profession. And so this is what creates all of the tension, is there isn't a way for someone just to present themselves to work in a non-degree high skilled job as an immigrant. And so the only access point is asylum. And so this is what creates a lot of the issues. So when people come as a family, then you have to decide, do you use this Title 42 authority right now? Do you exclude people or not exclude people? And one of the complications is there are families, if you're reading the accounts, that are being allowed into the United States. And so no matter what percentage it is, some people are saying it's a large percentage, the administration is saying it's a small percentage, whatever it is you want to say, whether it's large or small. When the message comes through that there is success, that message, there's a debate here too. There are some people who say migration has nothing to do with the policies you put on. And that's one group. I don't subscribe to that. I think, of course, it's sensitive to the policies you put on, but that's, people can have that debate. But the question is, does it have an incentive? How much does it have an incentive or not have an incentive when people hear that families are now being led into the United States for the processing of their case? Then another debate is detain or don't detain those families while their case is being used. Do you process the case, but do you process it and remain in Mexico like the Trump administration did, or do you allow people to do it from inside the United States? And then finally, what is a family unit? Because right now, as I was saying, a family unit is just a custodial parent and their child. And so it's not an aunt or their niece, or it's not a cousins or grandparents and their grandchildren. And so those families get separated, which is its own human tragedy. Should that continue? Should that not continue? Next slide. Next slide. Okay, yes. And so then single adults are sort of always the largest group of people trying to cross the border. They get the least sympathy from any administration. They're always excluded and given expedited removal. The one thing that does happen, though, is the more that the Border Patrol has to deal with unaccompanied children, which are very labor intensive to process, or families, then you do miss some number of the single adults crossing the border. And so that is a concern that always comes up as the numbers of others get larger. And so the question is, what do you do about these things? And so this is a complicated question that I don't think the Biden administration has really been forced to grapple with by the media, which is so everybody understands that now their goal is address the root causes of immigration. They've articulated that very well. We want to make it so that people don't even want to come here because the root causes of the immigration in their country are solved. Well, we have to have a discussion about that. It's an important question because I think one thing, and I have those links and you can feel free to look at it. If you look at those links, and granted, I'm using Wikipedia, but I'm going to assume it's still, even if it's not exactly correct, it'll be close enough to correct. But it's the best site I found that I'll look. If you take the Northern Triangle Central American countries, you'll see that they have a GDP of somewhere $3,000 to $4,000 per person, a per capita GDP. And if you look at Mexico, you'll see that Mexico has a per capita GDP of something like $9,000 per person. So here's the question. You would have to make an inordinate amount of change to get the Central American Northern Triangle countries to be just as prosperous as Mexico. I mean, that's basically impossible, can't be done. But let's say you could somehow succeed in tripling their GDP, their per capita GDP, to make them just as successful as Mexico, which would be amazing and would be great. And immigration had been basically flat from Mexico. What we're seeing right now is we still have this huge Mexican unaccompanied minor. This is what the next link shows. Right now, we have this huge Mexican unaccompanied minor and single adult influx coming into the United States. So the question is, what is success look like really in this root cause thing? Because what I'm showing you is even if you triple the per capita GDP of 3 countries, so that's a lot to ask for, that's a lot of investment to get there, you still might not solve your migration problem. You still might end up with the kind of migration you're seeing from Mexico right now. And so it's not a simple problem. And so what do you do when you know that? And so the question is there some kind of carrots and sticks approach that can work? So I've advocated, and I'm not trying to tell you on anything, but I've advocated always, first of all, if someone's a refugee, you got to recognize they're in an imminent crisis. So you must set up a facility that a person can go to, a human being can go to, that solves their imminent safety problem. And you can set those up anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, Mexico or any of the Central American countries, and you can have America reach agreements where we guard those facilities and we house those facilities. And it is my view that you can do that much more inexpensively than what we're paying to do that here. And then you can flood those facilities with immigration lawyers and refugee counselors and all of that. And then people can actually make their refugee claim there. And if they make it there and it's successful, you let them in, period. And so it's fair and you can make the case. And the key thing is, though, that you would need Congress to ultimately codify this, in my view, because obviously you could have the Biden administration build this all up and then Trump administration part 2 could tear it all down and then somebody else builds it back up and then somebody else tears it all down. So that's a problem. And so you'd want bipartisan congressional buy-in to such an approach. But I think such an approach can be built where you can fairly get people's claims adjudicated and you don't have to do it with all of the cost of the system that we're creating now in the United States with tents and convention centers and warehouses and infrastructure and all of that. And you can actually use that money on lawyers and counselors and the facilities in these places and guarding them so that they're safe facilities for folks there. But that's just my view on this. There's plenty of ways to do this, but the question that needs to be asked, and I don't think has been answered, is there any deterrence to this strategy? Meaning, if you don't use a certain way and you keep presenting yourself at the border, is that still going to be a route to success during the entire 4 years of the Biden administration? And if that is, if you can always present yourself at the border and that can be a route to success, then that, in my view, that makes the system more complicated to get under some sort of orderly entry flow than if that's not. But everybody's worried about this deterrence part of it, building it, because it's perceived as mean and hard-hearted and mean-spirited. And so I understand all of that, and that makes this much more complicated. Next slide. Okay, then the next issue is, what about the people who are already here? What's going to happen to them? And so, forgetting about legislation, which we'll talk about the next slide, there's some decisions ICE has to make. Is ICE going to remove people with criminal convictions? There's a lot of pushback in the immigrants' rights community that unless you have some very, very, very violent criminal conviction, you shouldn't be removed for any other issues other than violent criminal convictions. And so that's an interesting question ICE is grappling with right now. What's going to happen? What about people who are recent border crossers? What happens is, if you get put into the normal asylum system, which takes 3 or 4 years, by the time that case is denied, now you've built a lot of ties in the United States. Maybe you've had a U.S. citizen child since then. Maybe you've had a job you've acquired and something else. Now you have equities, even though you were a quote unquote recent border crosser at one time. Now you're not so much anymore. What does that mean for you? Should you be removed at that point after you've gone through this whole process and your case has been denied? What if you committed immigration fraud? Is that something that should matter? Or is that something because the system is so draconian, it forced you into committing immigration fraud? So those are questions that are being grappled with. And then, will any new administrative programs be enacted? We're hearing about the regulation that the administration wants to do with DACA. Is it going to expand the group of eligible people? And then we're going to obviously see what the courts do with DACA. Will temporary protected status be given to more countries? That could happen. You know, Haiti's talking about adding people, and Nicaragua is talking about adding people, and Honduras is talking about adding people. You know, that America would give more TPS. And so I don't know, we'll see. I wrote an article about, look, just do it for everybody based off of COVID. If we can't exclude people, what I wanted to do is I wanted to sort of say, look, COVID is COVID, and you got to apply this uniformly. So if we're not letting people in, we shouldn't force people to go out, but we should be consistent. Nobody comes in, nobody comes out, and give temporary protected status to everyone during this COVID. And then you could sort of then put people in a better position later to be dealt with congressionally. And then finally, there's all kinds of people here who entered by crossing the border without status, and those people have no solution unless they get something called a parole that then allows them to get a green card if they married a U.S. citizen. And so will those paroles be granted by the Biden administration? Will they create a program for that purpose? Next slide. Okay, then there are some very interesting legal immigration issues going on right now. If you click on that link that I put on universities, you'll see that the amount of students coming into the United States from the end of the Biden administration to the end, from the end of the Obama administration to the end of the Trump administration went down from like 530,000 to about 350 under Trump, which was bad enough. But then last year, because of COVID, we let in about 120,000 students. And so that's a lot of money. We're talking about tens and tens of billions of dollars that get lost in America when you don't let in foreign students. And so right now there's a deadline. These students are getting their acceptance letters as we speak. And the question is, can you open consulates in enough time to get students visas so that they come to school here in America for fall 2021 instead of either going to some other country or staying at home in school? And so if we get another 120,000 a year or something even less, we're talking about just in 1 year's tuition. Let's say they even all transferred to the US next year. You're talking about $15–20 billion that is lost in the US economy. If you're talking about that they never do the whole 4 years of school, you're talking about almost $100 billion of lost potential to the economy. And so this is an issue that the universities are really pushing hard. Hey, open up the consulates again, open up the consulates again. And then now employers are doing that too, saying, hey, come on, let's get this going. There's no reason to be banning people anymore. People are getting vaccinated. Let them get vaccinated. Let them get a visa. Let them come to the United States. In the meantime, USCIS over the last 4 years has placed many, many, many barriers to legal immigration. Applications get rejected for the slightest of missing words or phrases. They get rejected because now one of the funny things they're doing is they're not opening envelopes for 2 or 3 months, and then they're changing the form you have to use. So they're saying this is an old edition, and then the edition became old because of the form you had to use. And because it's been sitting there for 3 months, they didn't open up the envelope. And then they say, oh, well, you sent in the wrong form. And so they send it all back. They do little things like that to reject applications. And so somebody's got to get confirmed at USCIS and fix all of that nonsense that they put in that completely made it basically grinding, that grinded all of the material so that, nothing can move again. So that's legal immigration. And then last slide. Long-term immigration legislation. Can anything pass? Can the DREAM Act pass? Can TPS, giving the people who currently have temporary protected status, green cards pass? Bill for agricultural workers, anything else? And, what you have Republicans saying is, look, well, you have to do something about what's going on at the border. And so the question is, what? What can be agreed to? Can Democrats agree to anything with Republicans? Can they agree to how this process can be changed? As to who can accept us, who can get asylum, as to what happens with families and unaccompanied minors, et cetera. Can a process be agreed to by both parties that has something for both. It's a compassionate process that actually accepts everyone that is a refugee, but maybe processes that person not inside the interior of the United States. I don't know, but I can see that being the parameters of such an agreement, but I can see Republicans not wanting to allow everyone with a successful refugee claim in the United States. And I can see Democrats not wanting to cut off the border as a potential refuge for a legitimate refugee. And so those become intractable parts of the negotiation. And so with that, I will answer questions because I've gone far too long. So go ahead. Chris, you're on mute. Oh, there you go. Okay.
Go to Elena first.
Hello, Elena? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Hi, my name's Elena. I am a producer for Morning Edition at NPR. I thank you so much for going over so many different parts of this expansive epic topic. I'm curious what you think, or in your opinion, what are the main, I mean, not to like prioritize parts over others, but are there specific issues you'd like to see the media cover more in regards to our current state of immigration policy and the Biden administration's upcoming priorities? What are you really like focusing on, and what do you think is like lacking in national coverage?
Well, I think the border is rightfully getting the coverage it deserves from the standpoint of, it's both a humanitarian story and there is something different happening there than was happening earlier. So I understand that, but I do think that at the moment, what interests me most, and may not be what interests other people, is this incongruence in how we treat COVID with regard to immigration. I think that is a fascinating issue, and I don't think anybody's covering that. And I think COVID is either a thing or it isn't a thing. And I don't know what we're doing right now. I don't think it's fair, me personally. I don't have anything against, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying tighten the southern border. Don't get me there. But I don't think it's right that you can be vaccinated from Europe and you can't come. That to me makes no sense. I don't understand that. And it doesn't mirror what then you would see if you hear a story about an unaccompanied minor shelter where a lot of the kids have COVID. I don't know what message that sends. So for me, I think it's incumbent upon the administration to get working very quickly on criteria whereby people can avoid these travel bans and show that they don't have COVID. And so that's one priority for me. But I think you could make that a writ large question about one, a COVID strategy writ large with respect to foreign nationals. Can we treat them all consistently? Number one. And number two, what are we doing to get students back into the country, to get seasonal workers back into the country as these hotels are going to start opening up again for the summer, et cetera. And so is the State Department going to take this seriously? Are they going to ramp up? And can we get people in the country? That for me is the story that's not being covered. I'm not saying it's more important than the border. It's not. I'm just trying to answer the question as to what I think that, is the uncovered story at the moment.
Thank you.
All right, Caroline.
Thank you so much for doing this. I just started covering immigration a couple weeks ago for CQ Roll Call, so this has been immensely helpful to me in kind of getting a handle on everything. I wanted to ask, it seems like the Biden administration has sort of been caught flat-footed about their intake capacity for all these unaccompanied minors, and that they're having to keep them for longer than 72 hours in these border facilities that aren't supposed to have children, and they're having to set up new emergency intake centers every week. Is there anything that the administration could have done to prepare for this or to be able to handle it more effectively?
So you're asking me what I would have done. And so this is not Monday Morning Quarterback. You can go look at my sort of subliminal messages in Politico and some other places. Right? Not exactly say it so overtly, but I would have said, look, this doesn't now have to be a racist thing because Europe is banned, Brazil is banned, China is banned, South Africa is banned. So we're covering a lot of different ethnic groups here. We're banning huge swaths of the world of all kinds of people. Let's tell all of our immigrants' rights communities that we know are important. We need 3 months to build capacity. We know we don't have people vaccinated yet. we don't have facilities. We're going to use this Title 42 authority until, let's say, Memorial Day. And we're going to build this capacity out, because the capacity that's something that people should have known, because we've always had, at the height of immigration, this level of kids starting to come across the border. This is not, it's just a level that had been shut down again, so it needed to be rebuilt again. This is the problem. So when you shut it down, but there's not a question that you would have needed this number again. And so you would say, let us rebuild these numbers, part one, and let us do the turn back. Let us announce to the world, you're going to be turned back until Memorial Day, no matter what you do or whatever. And then you built the capacity, and then you've allowed people to go and access a fair system at that point. In my view, that would have been the policy equivalent of saying don't come now. Because just saying don't come now, what does that mean? It doesn't, to me, it has no meaning. And so you need, either you back that up with policy, or it's not something you're backing up with. So that's what I would have done. It's not easy, but at least it would have been a globally consistent policy. And then when you decided it was okay for people to start coming into America again, no matter where they were coming from, then you could have opened up the southern border again. So, yes, go ahead. Other questions?
Orion.
Hey, Leon, thanks for doing this. Orion Donovan Smith with the Spokesman Review in Spokane, Washington. I covered Dan Newhouse in the House, Central Washington representative, the lead Republican on the farm workforce bill. And that's something that's, in the last Congress, I followed that some and talked with him quite a bit about it. I'm really interested in the chances for that bill in particular passing, and also Dream and Promise. He's pushed on, been one of the few Republicans behind that. But I'm just curious if you got any insight into the politics of things now, with more attention on the border. Do you think there's any shot of the farm workforce bill passing?
I think there's a Democratic problem and a Republican problem. So I'll start with this. First of all, if this was a robot, the robot would pass the bill because A, it's a bill everybody knows is necessary, and B, it's a bill that actually has massive bipartisan support if people were just voting their conscience and not anything else. So we start with that. But what are the political problems? For Democrats, the political problem is, do you give a big win to a business interest, essentially, which is the ag industry, without first having taken care of the non-business components of immigration, like Dreamers and TPS? This has been always a huge, for whatever reason, irritant for Democrats. If they don't want the business interest to win first, they want them to either win at the same time or after the Dreamers, especially as a constituency. And then on the Republican side, as you mentioned, the border becomes a major issue now that they're trying to exploit. And so will they insist upon will they insist upon the kinds of changes I talked about, to who's eligible for asylum? Can you present yourself at the border? And can you detain families, which you can't do right now under the law, in order to approve something like the ag worker bill? And I think at the end, the amalgamation of those two things will make it impossible to pass the ag bill, because Democrats already don't necessarily want to pass it first. You see what I'm saying? It's all you need to do is give them an excuse. And so the excuse is, oh, you want these changes? That's the problem. So it would have to be a clean vote. And is it possible that the ag bill alone gets a clean vote in the Senate? I'm not optimistic about that, but I can't say for sure.
Okay, so we have Caroline Kelly and then Tia. Oh, and also Orion, I apologize, I mispronounced your name last time, so.
And somebody on the top board wanted to ask a question also.
Yeah, that's Tia.
Oh, okay. Okay, good.
So Caroline.
Thank you again for holding today's session. I just had a quick, a detailed question on something that you mentioned before, that if unaccompanied minors arrive from Mexico, they are not detained. Who are they returned to?
So they literally are just, I don't want to use this crude pushing back into Mexico, but that's basically what happens. That they're just taken to the nearest port crossing of the port that they enter. If they entered at a port of entry, they're just turned back onto the Mexican side of the port of entry. And if they're in between the ports of entry, they're taken to the nearest port of entry and turned back.
Does that only apply to the child, not the adult who is with them?
If an adult came in from Mexico, they would be placed in something called expedited removal. And only if they articulated an asylum claim would they be allowed to stay. And that's the same with the child. The child is placed into expedited removal. The difference between Mexicans and everybody else is this law that I mentioned before, the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, does not allow children to be placed in expedited removal, meaning you can't just immediately remove somebody you encountered. But it allows an exception for Mexican children because Mexican children are right at the border. So the perceived harm is not the same as if you dump someone from some other country in the world into Mexico. You can't do that. That's not their country. It can't be done. And so that's considered cruel and draconian because you're placing them somewhere that isn't in their country. But the idea, I guess, behind this bill was that Mexico is this person's country. And so you can place the child into expedited removal. So that's what would happen with either a Mexican adult or a child. They'd be placed into expedited removal. And the only way that they would be allowed to enter the United States is if they could establish what's called a credible fear of persecution on account of one of the protected factors. And then they'd be allowed to make their full asylum claim. But if they said they did not face a fear of persecution, they would be immediately turned back into the United States. Whereas a child who doesn't articulate a persecution claim from anywhere else in the world is still allowed to remain in the United States while the full removal proceeding is happening.
Thank you.
I think
Last
it's,
question to Tia.
yes. Hello, thank you so much for chatting with us. I wanted to ask, I'm Tia Mitchell with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I wanted to ask, what questions should I be asking? We write a lot about agriculture and you have the migrant workers and that impact on immigration, which is different than like the border issues.
Yeah.
So what should I be looking for and what questions should I be asking?
Well, number one, I think it's important to ask, adding on to Orion's question, do you support the agricultural bill being placed in the Senate as a standalone bill? Both to Republicans and to Democrats. I think that's an important question. And would you vote for or against it without border provisions if you're asking that to a Republican? So, and then I think that's an important thing for the agricultural industry to know in Georgia is a Republican member of Congress going to insist on changes that have nothing to do with agriculture to do the agricultural bill? Or are they going to, are they going to allow it to be, would they vote for it if it's written as is? And then the same with Democrats, basically. Are Democrats going to insist on changes because they would want Dreamers to be added to it or something else? And so I think that's an important issue. And I don't know how many straight answers you would get if you asked those questions. So they'd be interesting to ask.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, well, Leanne, I think it's noon right now, so that we need to draw the session to a close. I want to thank you very much for that info-packed presentation. Fellows, reach out to Leon. He's accessible and very knowledgeable and very helpful. So I think can be a great source for you to have going forward. Now we're going to have 3 practitioners talking about coverage of immigration, both the current situation on the border, and then beyond that, all the other things that come up on a regular basis that need to be kind of tackled on the beat. We have with us 3 reporters who are on the beat. I asked people like Leon Fresco and others who are the best reporters on this beat that I should reach out to, and all of their names came up on multiple lists when I made those inquiries. We have Adolfo Flores, who's a national security and immigration correspondent for BuzzFeed News. We have Michelle Hackman, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Dara Lind, a reporter for ProPublica. Michelle and Dara are here in DC. Adolfo is based in Texas. He had been based in McAllen on the border, and now he is in Austin. And I also do want to share a little bit about Michelle, who you should be seeing her picture right now. This is Michelle winning the NPF's Dirksen Award a couple of years ago with their colleague James Grimaldi for their coverage of HHS Secretary Tom Price's stock trading. Remember, that was a scandal they uncovered back in 2016, and they won the award. 2016 or 2017, they won the Dirksen Award,
2016.
our 2017 Dirksen Award.
Yeah.
So we are glad to have her back as a speaker for us. So it is 12:10. We have them until 1:10. Adolfo is going to go first, talking about coverage of the border and how you cover it, what you need to look out for, how you talk with people who and families who are coming across, how you try to talk with border security agents, although that's a difficult task. Michelle is going to kind of talk about how she approaches a beat and how immigration touches all sorts of different beats that you're looking at, and from her audience for the Wall Street Journal, how immigration touches all sorts of industries. And then Dara is going to talk about resources you should be aware of, data sources you should be aware of, and other things that you need to kind of understand how to conceptualize and report on the beat. We just want this to be a nice informal Q&A, or nice informal panel and Q&A. If you have a question as we're going along, I think it's okay to raise your hand throughout. And so we'll hear from each of the three, and then take questions for the whole group. But if you have a question throughout, just raise your hand and we'll work some of those in as well. So I will start with Adolfo.
Yes, and yeah, please feel free to interrupt me, because I will probably ramble at some point. But yeah, so a lot of my work focuses on how immigration policies affect immigrants on the ground. And so part of the reason why I moved to McAllen was because it was very hard to do from my desk. I'm sure there's like some reporter out there who's great at doing that. I just was really struggling, so I figured the best thing to do was to move, to where I could talk to people face to face, of course, before the pandemic. And so I moved to the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas to do that. And I just think it's really important to, if you can, right, to consistently be there. And I did a lot of reporting out of this camp, this immigrant camp on the Mexican side of the border. And I think it really helped people open up to me, because they kept seeing me go back, every week or every other week. So, one thing I do tell people is, if you're able to, people can see your face often, do that, because it definitely pays off. It builds trust. This was like a camp, right? But if you're covering like an area or a community, and you keep going back, you'll benefit a lot from it. And I think right now it's really hard. I would say, to get people to open up, because when you go down to the border, I was there last week. There's so many reporters. They're all like going to the same places, the same areas on the border, or the same shelters. And so it's not the ideal environment to get people to open up, because they're sort of like met with this like horde of reporters. But you have to do it sometimes. And so the best advice I would give to people in that situation is to really be empathetic, and then authentically like show people like you're very interested in their story. There's so many times where I see people, other reporters, kind of like go in there, rush in there, and ask these like very probing questions because they need that quote, and they ask it without sort of taking the time to make that person comfortable. And they may get that quote, but people notice, the people who let you in, right? If you're working with an NGO, they'll remember how you were, and the next time you have to go back, they may not help you. And I've seen that happen. So a lot of empathy, and making sure that people understand too. Like I spent a night on the river, just waiting for people to come across on these rafts. And I wanted to make sure that they understood that I was going to ask them questions that were going to be published. And one of the concerns I had is, are they even in the mental state to be able to like give that consent, right? Informed consent of, you know, me sharing their story. And so I really I took the time to like stop and, you know, ask them how they were doing, you know, where they came from. And, you know, just even like 2 minutes of just no writing, just like talking to them and explaining what I was going to do. You know, I'm a writer, a reporter, you know, doing this, you know, piece on what it's like. I really would like to talk to you. And I always tell them, like, you don't have to talk to me, by the way, you can just keep going. Like, you know, and I'm sure my editor would hate if they kept hearing me tell people you don't have to talk to me. But these are people who aren't used to talking to the press. And so I think you have to really, I don't know, try to like level with them so they understand what they're getting into. And people appreciate it. I hardly ever had anyone say no. I had one person tell me no, even though I gave him like 10 chances to say no to me. And he's
Adolfo, just I do have those links that you sent.
Oh yes,
if
yes.
there-
Okay, sorry.
If there are particular stories you wanted me to pull
Yeah.
up. So I was
Yeah. So the one about Hope, Asylum and Hope. One, I think it's the third one I sent you.
okay. Now let me. Is everybody seeing this slide that says the unicorn on it?
Yes,
Okay.
I can see it. So this is a guy that I met at that camp I mentioned in Matamoros in Mexico, who I honestly didn't think I was going to write about, but I would always see him at the camp. I always say hi. We'd always catch up. How are you doing? He always like let me know what was going on at the camp. And, you know, this is someone that I built like a, you know, like a rapport with, a friendship, I don't know, some kind of relationship with, so that when he won his case on his own after the fact, you know, it really helped me be able to get that story and for him to open up to me, because I had taken the time over months, even though I wasn't planning on writing about him, to just get to know him. And I think he not only helped me talk to other people that he knew who would be good for other stories, eventually he was a story. So, you know, sometimes those 5 minutes may seem like a lot if you're in a rush doing another story, but they pay off. So I highly recommend doing that. And the other story that I did, another one that I really liked from last year, was people who fell in love at the border. Same thing at the camp. You know, and that was a little hard at first because like I was, you know, asking random people like, yeah, you know, who do you know here that's falling in love? But again, like I knew like a volunteer there, and who, you know, took the time to like walk me around and introduce me to folks that she thought had fallen in love at the border. And, you know, again, that's because I put in the time to work with this volunteer, also like talk to them and catch up. You know, if you can't be there on like in person, I would say that you should call the people who are there, like the volunteers and the NGOs, when you're not on deadline, you know, so they can get to know you, so that when you are on deadline and you call them and you're like, I need something now, they're not just like, who is this random person? And it can be hard to sort of plan that out, especially if you have a very broad beat. But if you can, I highly recommend it. And I think those were all the things I had, right? Yeah. But yeah, I don't. That is it. That's all the advice I've got.
Okay. Well, let's go to Michelle.
Hey everyone. I'm actually relatively new to the beat myself, or I guess I shouldn't keep saying that. It's been almost 2 years, but you know, nothing like these other two guys. So I thought I'd give you sort of a rundown on if you were asked to write an immigration story, if you were put on the immigration beat, how you can sort of approach doing that. And I've been a policy reporter my whole time in Washington. I've covered healthcare, I've covered some higher education and student debt issues. And so this was like the third policy beat that I've started on. And so, I wanted to talk about the places you'd look for immigration news and sort of how you can go about building up that beat. So, and by the way, just as Adolfo said, feel free to interrupt me. I also meant to write y'all a tip sheet, and like a reporter, I totally ran out of time. So if anyone needs one afterward, like please send me a message and I can share a cleaned up version of my notes with you guys. So, where can immigration news come out of? Obviously, there's the executive branch. Immigration policy is set at the White House, but it's also carried out by several agencies, the Department of Homeland Security being key, and there are some sub-agencies there that handle different aspects of immigration. There's US Customs and Border Protection. Obviously that does what it sounds like. It's the Border Patrol. It's the guys at the airports screening in your stuff and screening in immigrants. There's ICE. That's the sort of branch of DHS that does deportations and sort of other investigations of immigrants here. If you hear about like workplace raids, that's ICE. And then there's USCIS that handles the legal immigration system. So that's anything from citizenship, green cards, all types of work visas, which are really interesting to me and my readers as the Wall Street Journal. And then anyone who's asking for asylum goes through USCIS. Anyone who's applying to move here as a refugee goes through USCIS. But just as in other beats, there's sort of all sorts of agencies around the government that touch immigration. And you should think about this in terms of, any beat, there's maybe a primary agency, but there are all sorts of other agencies that have their hand in immigration. So the Justice Department, it somewhat sets policy. The Justice Department actually also runs the immigration court system, which that's where you go if you're not here with a permanent legal status and you want to ask for asylum, if you want to avoid being deported. Those judges are actually federal government employees. They're not like independent judges the way you'd think from their title. The Department of State issues a lot of visas abroad. The Labor Department controls a lot of who is able to get a green card. If they're being sponsored by their employer, they set a lot of rules around work visas. And there's a host of other agencies that also touch immigration. Agriculture, a lot of farmers rely on immigrants to actually do a lot of their work for them. And a lot of those people come on guest visas. And then Congress. So, if you're covering a new policy beat, one of the places you'll want to start is sort of acquainting yourself with all of the committees that touch whatever area it is you're covering. So, for immigration, you would go to the Homeland Security Committee, the Judiciary Committee, which actually runs immigration policy. And then a tip that you wouldn't you guys are all many of you are Congress reporters, so forgive me if I'm speaking too basically about this, but the Appropriations Committee is always a really great place to start because they set policy via giving agencies money. And so they'll attach all sorts of strings to that money, and they have a good view into how that money is being spent, how it's not being spent, if it's being misspent. And so, starting on the beat, being able to get to know all of those agencies, all of those committees, having coffee with all the spokespeople of those committees is a really good idea. I think we often sort of poo-poo spokespeople and other sorts of PR folks, but those people can actually be really good sources to you. I'm sure you all know this already. And so that's where you'd want to start. You also want to do sort of a 360-degree view of sourcing. And so it's not always going to be easy to just get someone inside of an agency to tell you what they're up to, especially if it's not what they should be up to, right? And so, there are a host of folks that I typically go to. You want to get to know everyone sort of in the advocacy world of what you're covering. Here in DC, there are also folks all around the country. For immigration, a great place to start is actually speaking to immigration lawyers because they have a really good view into how the government is either handling or mishandling immigration cases. You know, if they say they are wrongly rejecting a lot of my cases, or processing times are really shooting up and people are losing their work permits and losing their jobs, that's a great place to know that something is happening, even if the government is not telling you. And that exists in a lot of different policy areas. You know, with healthcare, you can speak to hospitals, you can speak to like local folks who are signing people up for health insurance. And that's the kind of thing where they can sort of, they're on the ground in a way that you're not. And so they can say, hey, I'm noticing this strange trend. And you can sort of build up from there. You also want to try to find a sort of neutral, I always use the term like neutral think tank, like someone who can sort of lay out basic facts. On immigration, there are all sorts of legal issues where I'm always finding like, I thought I knew, like, I thought I knew how this would play out or what the legal issues are, but I don't always. And so there's a great organization, if you ever find yourself covering an immigration story, if there's one thing you write down, the name of this organization is the Migration Policy Institute. I think like every beat has a place like this to turn to. Like with healthcare, it's the Kaiser Family Foundation. And the key thing is you want to be able to say, you know, people, even though they disagree on the sort of policy matters of immigration or healthcare or whatever it might be, they agree that this organization at least is putting out reliable data, uses reliable information. You know, a really good example of that is actually in the abortion debate. There's an organization called the Guttmacher Institute that is, you know, they're sort of a pro-choice organization, but even anti-abortion organizations cite their statistics. That's sort of how reliable they are. And here MPI is sort of that equivalent. And then I always, starting a beat, continuing on a beat, you always want to be getting to know former officials in the agencies or even the committees that you're covering. You know, recent formers are probably the most useful to you because they might know people inside, can give you sort of a feel for what's going on, for the particular frustrations people are having. But I always try to go back like at least 2 administrations, like last Republican, last Democrat, because even if they don't sort of know exactly what's currently going on, they can sort of give you a really good history lesson, lay of the land. It's really good to pick people's brains like that. I would also recommend, this is one thing that someone actually passed on to me that I'm going to pass on to you guys, to sort of think about policy beats in buckets and sort of make sure that you are touching each of those buckets every so often so that you're varying your coverage. You know, for example, with immigration, the big story right now is obviously the border. And I think the 3 of us are mostly writing about border issues, but it's good to take a step back and say, you know, there are all different facets of the immigration system. There is, you know, that legal immigration system I mentioned, all these issues with visas and green cards. There is, you know, immigrant communities in the country and how they're sort of interacting with immigration enforcement agents. You know, deportation is an issue. And so you want to be able to step back and say, wait, have I looked at these other buckets recently? Have I tried to report a story out in one of these buckets? And, you know, pick up the phone and call some sources and say, what are you hearing? What's the latest thing? What should I be writing about? And then I just wanted to say, you know, I think it's probably more common that a lot of you will be dipping in and out of immigration coverage rather than being put on the beat full time, although it's the best beat in the world and you should try to be put on it. One thing I would recommend, or a few things I would recommend are, you know, many of you are covering Congress. And so you want to be paying attention to any big bill that comes out of Congress. You know, there is often a little immigration policy change tucked into a bigger bill that's moving. And, you know, if it's already been found, it's probably quite controversial. If no one else has written about it yet, your story is going to get a lot of clicks because immigration is just like, it's one of those keywords that people just click on. I think a good example of this, and actually, I'm sorry, I'm previewing something Dara might talk about, but there was a defense bill last year where they actually—
Oh no, totally talk about that.
Okay. Well, Dara totally got to that story ahead of me. That was on my whip list. But there was a defense bill that passed last year, and tucked into it was a legalization program for a really small group of immigrants in the country, Liberians, who had sort of had temporary deportation protections. And someone just sort of championed their cause, said, this is like 4,000 or 5,000 people, let's give them green cards. Passed, almost no one noticed. And then the Trump administration completely slow-walked that program and tried to make it so as few people could get green cards as possible. And actually that Dara wrote a great story about this. The other thing I would mention is that immigration touches so many other policy areas, so many other topics that you might be writing about. You know, obviously for you guys, it's a real big issue in politics and sort of identity politics. But if you're writing about anything else, you might want to say, what is the like cross section of how this area touches immigration? So, you know, for example, healthcare, there are big immigration issues of how you treat someone who sort of doesn't have health insurance, who can't be covered by Medicaid. In education, there are all sorts of issues around, you know, especially right now at the border, when a lot of children are coming into the country, they're temporarily, permanently, those children are English language learners, and how do schools meet them where they are? You know, foreign students, huge business for colleges. That's something I write about often. They're actually one of our biggest exports. We make about $42 billion a year off of foreign students. So that's one thing. And then there are a ton of industries that rely really heavily on immigrants. And so they have stakes in Washington and are always really eager to sort of weigh in on those debates, you know, anywhere from tech to farmers, as I mentioned, to agriculture, to like tourism, and then places you wouldn't even think about. You know, I wrote a story a few weeks ago with a colleague who brought to my, you know, this was something vaguely on my radar, but she came to me and she said, I cover entrepreneurship, and people are really, really eager to see, you know, a program put in place that would allow foreign entrepreneurs to be able to move here, because right now there's no visa program. If you're a foreign student or something and you start a company, like we make it really hard for you to stay. And often people move and bring their companies to Canada or to Europe or wherever it might be. You know, I'll bring up one other example. Last year, Trump introduced this sort of temporary ban on most types of immigration and visa categories. And one of them that sort of went unnoticed in the moment was that one of the categories that was banned was au pairs. And so I came back and I wrote a story about how this ban was sort of unwittingly hitting working moms really hard, because a lot of people rely on au pairs to be able to work full time, and au pairs just suddenly overnight got banned. So yeah, any questions, or I'm happy to pass to Dara.
Okay, yeah, maybe if we go to Dara, and then
Yeah.
after Dara, we will come back. Well, does anybody have any question right now? Do so, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Dara.
Hi, folks. So honestly, and this is very weird because I've been at ProPublica for like almost 2 years now, and it's not and this isn't, you know, I currently have a great deal of, you know, I'm not under pressure to like cover a ton of things. I'm not under pressure to write every day, but I'm still listening to what Adolfo and Michelle were saying and going, gee, it would be nice to have those kind of resources. Because I was just thinking back to being in, you know, even if you are nominally covering immigration as a beat, it can often be difficult to not get swarmed onto whatever the other story is. And it can often be extremely difficult to not feel like you're, you know, especially to zag against the zig, right? Is like, while what Michelle's talking about buckets is totally true and very important, can also be really hard to persuade editors in, you know, in really any newsroom. And so it can be, I don't know, the kind of harm reduction approach to this, especially if you're not in a position that is full-time immigration, where you have the ability to say, no, I cannot write about something that isn't immigration today. Like, that can be a big problem on such a complicated beat. I definitely have found myself in the position of like needing to take time to get up to speed on something that I had previously been aware of, but like between changes happening over time, and it's just so complicated that you kind of forget a lot of stuff just to clear space in your brain. You then have to take a step back in order not to get things wrong. And this is, I think, a really, like, this is a big priority for me as a journalist. And I think a lot of us who kind of fall in love with immigration develop this as a really strong imperative that, like, it can, because it is so complicated and because a lot of readers, depending on who your audience is, a lot of your readers haven't necessarily had personal exposure to the system, aren't necessarily in the areas where they're reading about, don't have a lot of that knowledge. It can be very easy to simplify things in a way that implies the wrong thing, or to just kind of be like, it can be very difficult to write things in a way that is not so complicated that like only a lawyer can understand it, but that also doesn't get things wrong and that doesn't risk people getting things wrong. I just had a story last week about the various kind of housing options for children, for unaccompanied children coming across the border. And I had to explain to to like a lot of people internally that, look, we have to, however we frame this in such a way that we don't end up with the implication that doing nothing would be better than doing something, because no one is saying that. And that would be taking a position that isn't a position that anyone is taking. So it can just, those things can be a little bit tricky to navigate. They can also frankly be an opportunity, because when there are kind of times when immigration is the focus, like right now is a pretty good example. If you look at public opinion graphs of immigration, and I don't really know if this is something that got covered in your previous panel, but like immigration isn't a big issue topic for most Americans under most circumstances. But then you'll occasionally have like 1 or 2 month periods where it's like the most important topic that people are telling, that people are telling Gallup pollsters is the most important issue facing America. And that's usually either when there's like a big legislative push or when there's a big media narrative of a border crisis. So that is something that like at this point, you can expect that when you're in a situation like right now, there's going to be more attention, there's going to be more, interest in having reporters write about this stuff. Personally, I think that, this, like from a very narrow interest perspective, this was probably a good time for another border crisis for immigration reporters who didn't want to be taken off the beat after Trump, because my assumption had been that a lot of editors were going to say this is a less important issue now than it wasn't under the previous president. And the last month or so has demonstrated that at least temporarily that's not the case. But what that means is that you have the opportunity when you're asked to dip into this stuff to, if you have the knowledge and background to say, okay, here is some historical context, or even just, okay, the numbers say this, but here is what is actually happening to people. That can be really, really valuable. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be doing all of that work yourself. There's a real virtue in being able to know, okay, let me look at what Adolfo's doing. Let me look at what other reporters who are in the Rio Grande Valley are saying. And there's a value in kind of having a good enough sense of the system that when you see a top line number, the one kind of regularly updated stat we get in immigration world from the government is the number of people who get arrested by Customs and Border Protection agents. They will at this point have monthly calls about that. And it can shape coverage in kind of a weird way. I was thinking last week, what would happen if instead of just the monthly jobs numbers being one morning of reporting, the 15 days before that and the 15 days after that were all, people are still losing their jobs. People are losing their jobs again. It can make it a really shallow cycle. But if you know that is coming and you are able to think through in advance of that, okay, what is the current policy regime for what actually happens to people after they're apprehended? What do we know from on the ground about who's getting released, who's getting sent back immediately, who's asking for asylum? That can be an opportunity to take something that could otherwise be a very superficial, dashing this off in an hour, to something that isn't going to take that much longer, but is really going to help people understand the system. Because that's kind of that's often the position that we as immigration reporters find ourselves in, is we are covering this. If you have the luxury to cover this full time, you are going through a lot of periods where it's seen as kind of a niche issue, and then it's an issue that everybody cares about. And the opportunity to say this isn't just this one spectacular image, or this isn't just this one video that you happen to see, asking yourself so that you can tell your audience, is this widespread? Is this new? Is this representative? Those are very important questions that can turn otherwise very one-off things. Like in 2017, there was a lot of increased coverage of ICE deportations because there were a couple of really spectacular, like, and I say spectacular not in the, not in the like effusive sense, but in the, they were spectacles. Videos of, like, there was one video that a daughter took on her cell phone camera of her dad being arrested by ICE. And that is the sort of thing where an editor is, depending on what kind of newsroom you're in, an editor is liable to say, hey, let's write something on this, or let's see what's going on with this. And the ability to say, okay, are apprehension, or like, are ICE arrests actually increasing, and for what kind of people is valuable there? That's really hard. ICE is not like CBP in terms of, like, they don't give those sort of real-time updates. And it can honestly, and this is something that even beat reporters can find, that takes a lot of like time and luxury. Like, you have to be doing a little bit of a survey of, like, what are local outlets writing, and then reading those stories critically, because the local reporters writing those stories may not understand the policy. So you have to kind of triangulate, ideally, if you have the ability, talking to local grassroots organizations, talking to immigration lawyers, and reading the local news reports to figure out who to go to there, can give you a decent sense of what things are looking like on the ground, but that's a lot of added work. That brings me to kind of another just operational reality of immigration, which is something that I think both Adolfo and Michelle mentioned indirectly, which is that a lot of this stuff comes through gatekeepers. I think ideally as reporters, we all want to be like directly in contact with being able to reach out to and talk to the subjects of our stories without anyone having to introduce us to them, right? Like, we don't want to feel like there's any intermediary going on there, but that's just not, both for kind of like, unless you're living among a community, it's not easy to just walk in and have that trust. And because frankly, the intermediaries are the ones who are going to be doing a little bit more. They might have been, especially when you're talking about border stuff, where like people coming to the US don't understand like 20 years of policy context, whereas the lawyers and NGOs helping them might. Like, they have a little bit more of the knowledge structure that they have is also useful to you and can help you figure out what the difference is between like one really compelling anecdote and the backbone of a bigger story that illustrates a larger phenomenon. And so kind of triangulating between, you never want to be totally constrained by a mediator. Like, the number of times I've talked to immigration lawyers who will be happy to talk to me about their client's case, and then I'm like, will you put me in touch with your client? And they're like, oh, I was like, I can't write the story now, y'all. You have to, you definitely have to be able to have a direct line, but you also need to kind of embrace the use of, and understand what the mediator's interests are, and when you might be kind of operating at not in totally the same line as that, and be honest with them about like, I may be willing, if this is what I find out, I'm going to be reporting this, even if that doesn't totally line up with like the way you see things. The same is true, frankly, if you are lucky enough to stumble into sources on the inside of government. Like, it is definitely very obvious to me, and I would assume to Adolfo and Michelle as well, that we're in the first months of a Democratic administration, because all of a sudden the people who were talking to us under the last administration because they disagreed with what was happening are now like clamming up and saying that either, because they don't necessarily want to undermine things that they agree with, or at very least because they want to like give the new guys a chance. And a truth of the immigration dynamic going back to the Obama administration is that like under Democratic presidents, the people who are most likely to be upset about what's happening are frontline Border Patrol and ICE agents, who are less likely to go to mainstream media than they are to go to Breitbart and Fox News. And then you have to be doing a kind of second level of, triangulation, even if you're just aggregating that stuff, to know what's true and what's being, spun. So it can, as long as, if you're lucky enough to like get direct access to somebody within government, understanding that whistleblowers generally are whistleblowing because they don't agree with what's happening, or at very least they want it to be clear that whatever is happening is not their fault. And knowing that when you write the story doesn't mean you have to reject the information that they're giving you out of hand. It's just an important step, and probably for other policy beats as well as immigration, but just because I think the immigration bureaucracy has gotten so politicized over the last half decade, it's especially true there. Like being able to think through, you know, what is the, being able to take the information that you're being given as valuable as long as it's reliable, while understanding that there's a reason that you got that information, and you might not be able to have, you know, that might not mean you're going to be able to develop this person forever and ever. But, you know, the flip side of that is you know, there are times when you can persuade an agency that usually doesn't talk to you that you're like trying to make them look good, or get, you know, or frame questions in a way that gives somebody an opportunity to say, it's not my fault, it's this other person's fault instead. And you don't have to use the "it's not my fault" part of that quote. The downside of the using news events to kind of shoehorn in bigger context things is that there are some ongoing trends that just don't have news hooks that I personally still haven't figured out how to cover, but that I think it's important to kind of be on the lookout for if you're really interested in this as an issue. Michelle talked through some of it in terms of the kind of generational nature of immigrant integration on the education side. It's generally, if you're going to be covering this stuff full time, you should definitely have like a basic sense of immigration history. And if you're not, you can usually fudge it by talking to folks from MPI. The Pew Research Center also has some really good statistical and analytical products on like the last few decades of immigration trends. History professors can be pretty useful, although they're generally coming at it from a very lefty perspective. And so, you know, if depending on what kind of newsroom you're in, you might be struggling with your editor to get a quote in that says like deliberately racist or whatever they are saying, but there's still like, it's still useful information to have. But one of the kind of upshots of that is that we do right now have a critical mass of people who are unauthorized in the US who have been living here for decades, which is like not something that has been true previously. And there was a little bit of like COVID specific coverage of like, what is COVID like for an unauthorized immigrant? But there wasn't as much, and I don't know how much of this is just that like last year was a weird year and how much is that it's hard to persuade editors and it's hard to like get a real audience for these pieces, but like the interaction of the category of essential worker with the kind of low skilled labor that immigrants have been asked to do, with the lack of employment protections that they often have, with the fact that there's a chilling effect in terms of, you know, seeking healthcare, even among people who actually don't face immigration consequences for it, which is actually another like meta point that I think is important, which is that, you know, few of us are writing directly for the people we're writing about, especially if we're writing in English. That said, we are often the people who lawyers will be reading, who, you know, the local news anchors who have to be delivering this in like a very condensed space will be reading, especially now that Spanish language local media has been hollowed out the same way the rest of local media has. Spanish language reporters will be reading. And so there's a real, there can be a real obligation that we don't always recognize, you know, to not just get it right, but to get it right and to be aware of the ways in which things might change people's behavior. You know, when the Trump administration was working on its regulation on changing or like instituting a definition of who counted as a public charge, who would have their immigration application rejected as a result. You know, I and a bunch of other people reported on various drafts of that were much broader than the eventual rule was. And as a result, when final rule did come out, like, yes, there was a lot of stuff in there, but there was also a lot of stuff that had been circulating in communities that was no longer true. And it's hard to pull that back. It's generally really hard to communicate this thing that you're afraid of, you shouldn't be afraid of anymore. And so that's something that I take very seriously in terms of wanting to balance people's sense of fear, which is an important thing you should be covering and communicating to your audience, with like what things are new, are increasing, are most prevalent. And balancing that is something that I think all of us like struggle with. But it does speak to the weird obligations of this beat, which is that it is always about people and about policy, not just about like a political culture war. And a lot of national newsrooms can, I think, easily lose sight of that. But at the same time, it's not actually helpful to those people to just focus on single individual stories. And that's kind of why, you know, the people who can be there every day and who can talk about things over time and who can, you know, like Adolfo, like identify months after the fact, actually, this did turn out to be a really important story, are important. But it's also just something that, as long as you bear it in mind and are doing the work of, you know, trying to connect any given data point to the broader trends, can make even one-off pieces or even a like part-time commitment to the beat super useful.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. Anybody with a question right now? One thing I was hoping you could talk about, Michelle, you talked about the Migration Policy Institute.
Yes.
What are there some other organizations, even that if they might lean left or lean right, that whatever their policy positions also have good data that you can trust?
Dara mentioned Pew is a really good one. If you're asking specifically about data, the government actually publishes a surprising amount of data.
Usually on a time lag, but yeah.
Exactly, usually on a time lag. But you know, there's all sorts of stuff about what types of visas are issued. ICE actually has all these requirements put on it from Congress about its detention centers. And so you can go on and see sort of what how many people are in immigration detention at any given point, things like that. And then there's this organization at Syracuse that you guys should familiarize yourself with. It's called TRAC. Do you remember what it stands for, Dara?
The Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse.
Thank you. And I don't actually know how they do it, but they FOIA government data and then they just sort of update it on a rolling basis.
Yeah.
I have no idea how the government gets back to them so much quicker than they get back to me, but apparently they do.
The government is basically,
like,
yeah.
lawsuits and then sorry they like
Yeah.
sue them and then they just have rolling like FOIAs the entire time.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I don't know how many other beats this is true of, but like basically TRAC and I think like it maybe one or two other institutions just have these like long standing, years and years long, like asking the Department of Justice for like a bunch of data on immigration courts. And so instead of responding to all our piddling little one-off FOIAs, the government just responds to that bulk FOIA and is like, we've done our job.
Yeah, exactly. I think TRAC they do some stuff on just general criminal justice issues. I'm not sure what else they do.
Federal prosecutions, which includes a lot of civil and antitrust stuff. And they also have like an environmental division.
Yeah, so you should familiarize yourselves with them regardless of whether you're doing immigration stuff. But I mean, one statistic that I turn to them really often for is there's this misperception, including among some of my editors, that like immigrants here who are applying for asylum just never show up to their court dates. And there are really handy TRAC statistics that say the exact opposite. And so I try to drop those into stories wherever I can.
Yeah, I would say that there are also some think tanks where you should, like in general, there are think tanks where you don't have to embrace the policy conclusions to accept the legitimacy of the data. And like, frankly, conversely, you shouldn't assume that the policy conclusions are being driven by the data. And then there are some where you like shouldn't even regard the data itself as that worthwhile. I think in the former category, the there are a couple of folks at the Cato Institute and at the Niskanen Center, both of which are libertarian organizations that have a pretty open borders mindset, but who do data work that goes
solid.
pretty further. It goes further afield than you would expect like typical like business immigration stuff to go, and is usually pretty solid. And also kind of can cover some stuff that hadn't necessarily occurred to people. Like I think Cato were the ones who came up with the statistic that legal immigration dropped like 92, 93% in 2020 thanks to Trump's COVID bans. Like very good statistic to have on hand, totally comported with everything we understood, but like just something that wouldn't have, it like needed
Been
a
out
think
there
tanker to
otherwise.
compile.
Yeah. There's a great organization called the National Foundation for American Policy also that does a lot of immigration and trade work. And I find their work really solid. I don't know if I'm giving you guys like tips that you're like, oh my God, I'm already a reporter. But if someone generally is using government statistics and writing reports off of sort of agreed upon data sources, then that is something I feel like I can pretty readily trust, as long as you don't feel like they're being manipulated in some crazy way. Where I tend to avoid statistics is, if an organization is conducting their own survey or is hiring a partisan pollster to do something like that. I find that informative about what they're sort of putting out there, but I would never use that in a story.
All right, so just a bit of trivia about TRAC out of Syracuse. It's actually started by a former journalist, a New York Times reporter named David Burnham, whose work on police corruption led to the movie Serpico in the 1970s. And he's been at TRAC for 25 years or something like that. So we'll go to Caroline Simon and then Orion.
Hey, thank you so much for being here. I just started covering immigration for CQ Roll Call a few weeks ago, so this has been very informative and helpful. I wanted to ask a little bit more about source building within federal agencies. I come from a very congressional background, and so this is my first time really covering policy through the lens of anything outside Congress. And I found myself kind of having to email these people for comment on like a daily story just because of how crazy the news has been before I've even really gotten a chance to like reach out and introduce myself, just because of the pace of the last couple of weeks. And I wanted to ask if you have any kind of advice about how to earn these people's trust and be able to get information out of them, just anything general that you might have.
Do you want to go first, Tara, or should I?
I mean, I'm going to elevate something that Michelle said in the chat, which is that like, this is just frankly, I'm very sorry for you because this is a really bad time. Like the Biden administration has so far continued the Obama administration's tradition of being very tight-lipped and high-handed with journalists.
Yes.
And that means that through the kind of front door of sourcing, it's like not super easy even to get people to respond to you. Much less to get them to actually answer your questions. And meanwhile, the backdoor stuff, like you just, the kind of obvious, like disgruntled, like Mark Felt is annoyed because he didn't get the job he wanted to, and so he's going to become deep throat stuff, like hasn't really materialized in this administration.
I think
and
it
is
will
being
eventually.
Yeah, like, or at least is being overshadowed by the kind of like, we want to give people a chance mindset. One thing I will say is that like, is that cold calling federal employees, like looking on LinkedIn and seeing who like currently works somewhere and just sending them a bunch of LinkedIn messages is like a very low hit rate, but it does work sometimes.
Agreed. I'd say 1 out of 100, but if you try to send 100 of those, you will get one back. Yeah.
And like, yes, there are people who are going to immediately forward that to their Office of Public Affairs, and their Office of Public Affairs will be like, go through us instead. But it's rare that somebody that like the OPA person will then like, if like that's you're unlikely to ruin a relationship, like unless they already had it in for you. It's generally, I think worthwhile to figure out who the person you're going to need to it's worthwhile to figure out who the person you're going to need to ask things from is. It's also worthwhile on immigration in particular to understand the dynamics between the individual agencies within USCIS and or within DHS and DHS headquarters, which can be very frustrating in terms of, if headquarters is trying to Bigfoot the agencies, that means you have to go through them to get anything, but can also result in some productive tensions that mean that some spokespeople are bitching to you about their counterparts, and so you can build relationships that way.
That's true. Yeah. Caroline, I feel like we'd have more specific advice for you that we can give offline, but like
Yeah.
generally speaking, this administration is a really good example of where that 360-degree approach has to come in, because a lot of what you're hearing, you sort of have to triangulate, where someone who was in the Trump administration will say, hey, I heard blah, blah, blah. And then you talk to a lobbyist and they're like, oh yeah, I've heard this too. And then you have to sort of quiz, if you're not able to talk to the person firsthand, you have to say like, okay, you're a lobbyist, you're obviously not in the government. How do you know this? Can you please tell me specifically who you were talking to or what kind of person it was, how many people you heard it from? You don't want to make sure that they're hearing something secondhand. And so, I think this is a matter of individual judgment more than just a rule of thumb of like, you need 3 of those people or something like that. But if you feel like you've confidently triangulated something, then being able to take it to the front door is often how I get things done.
All right,
Thank you.
Orion.
Thank you, guys. Orion Donovan Smith from the Spokesman Review in Spokane, Washington. I always try to, I don't get to focus just on immigration issues, but I try to cover them as much as I can. And I guess I'll have sort of 2 quick questions. I had done some reporting on the DED for Liberians when I was at the Washington Post. And so Dara, saw your story and was interested to follow that. And I just am curious how much, you think that's going to be resolved now. I know they extended DED once again, but I'm always just sort of baffled by that system and wonder like if there's a better way to deal with it than the existing thing. And then something I've been trying to figure out how to do a story on, and I guess I'd love to hear from all 3 of you guys or any of you, is like, Washington State in particular, like half of refugees recently have been like Slavic refugees from Ukraine and elsewhere, because of the Lautenberg Amendment sort of loophole thing. And I really struggled that, like, I really want to do a story on that, but I don't want to have a protagonist who's like, the person I'd focus on and be like, this guy doesn't deserve to be here. And trying to figure out how to approach a story like that, where maybe it's less of an issue now with refugee cap going back up. But I guess I just appreciate thoughts on telling that side of the story.
Were you the one who had that awesome story about the resettlement Valags in Spokane last week?
Yeah.
That was
I'm
great.
sorry,
That was
the
a great
resettlement.
The
Sorry, not last
resettlement
week.
organizations.
Last week, no, that was not me.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
I'm thinking of a different story.
Okay. That was, I was like, there was a really awesome story out of Spokane.
Yeah. I think that was like a weekly or something. The guy had
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But
Letter had that.
I am not gonna touch the "is there a better way to do things" question. In general, it's awesome to be a reporter because you get to acknowledge the hard questions are hard and don't have to have like better ways to do things. But like, as you know, through the history of DED, it's just kludge on kludge on kludge. I don't know if I also assume that it's going to get resolved more or less because of the extension on legalization applications and the extension of DED, but like, we'll see, man. I think that generally when I'm thinking about a story where that like confers maybe unfair benefits, rather than thinking about like, oh, I don't want to focus on a person who shouldn't be here, and like, if you can nail, the refugee who said they were an evangelical Christian and is now like going to Church of Satan meetings, like that's awesome. But like, assuming that doesn't exist, generally, I think the approach that I tend to find is if you can do some kind of juxtaposition to show the arbitrariness of the system, right? Like, obviously, ideally, you want, like, Diane Solis of the Dallas News just had a story about like 2 mothers who crossed over into the Rio Grande Valley and were treated differently because of the ages of their children. Like, ideally, you want that, but even just working with the kind of international NGOs to be like, can you find me somebody who, because they were a religious minority, or like because they like had a religious claim but weren't Lautenberg Amendment, like ended up stuck for ages and ages, whereas this person had a fairly easy time of it. That can really help refocus on the system rather than imply that particular people are trying to game it.